Chapter 11 is going to introduce us to the nervous system. And basically, the rest of AMP1 is dedicated to studying the nervous system. As you probably know, the nervous system can be a pretty complicated system involving obviously the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. So we cover it in a number of different chapters. This first chapter kind of gives us an introduction to the nervous system, how it's organized, both functionally and anatomically. So we'll talk about, the CNS or central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system. So these first few slides is really a general overview of how we organize the nervous system. Then this chapter gets into a lot of different cell types that are involved in the nervous system. So it's not all about the neurons. There are a lot of other cell types involved in the nervous system. Then we really focus in heavily on how a neuron works, which, understanding how neurons work involves a lot of ion channels and ions, and can be a little bit of a tricky topic. So when we get to that part in the chapter, we want to really slow down and focus in on those ions and ion channels. And then the last bit of this chapter talks about neurotransmitters. We've learned one up till now, acetylcholine, which stimulates skeletal muscle, but we're going to add to our list of neurotransmitters. So just looking at the topics, again, we're going to kind of understand the organization of the nervous system structurally. So basically, what do we mean by central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system? But also functionally, what do we mean by sensory or sensory neurons? Or what do we mean by motor neurons? And what do we mean by integrative functions? So that's kind of how we look at the nervous system, either structurally and functionally. The cells that are not neurons, these other cells, are called neuroglia cells or neuroglial cells. They don't transmit the action potentials. They do a lot of other functions to support the nervous system. Then we look heavily into neurons. We look at their cellular structure. We classify them both based on function and structure. So they might function differently, but they also have slightly different structure to them. We're going to look at how they work. This is called the action potential. That's probably the more difficult thing in this chapter, is understanding how that works. And then finally, neurotransmitters. So let's start by kind of organizing the nervous system based on structure over here. So you have the central nervous system, which is your brain, as well as the spinal cord that extends down from your brain. All right, so that's the CNS. And the CNS does a lot of the processing. We often refer to that as integration. So it's going to get a lot of sensory information, all right, that enters. It has to process that information and then determine what to do with that. The peripheral nervous system is how we get this information into the CNS and then get signals out of the CNS. So that's going to involve the nerves. And if you're a nerve and you're attached to the brain, we call you a cranial nerve. If you're a nerve and you attach to the spinal cord, we call you a spinal nerve. So there's a whole chapter dedicated to the brain and its cranial nerves, and then there's a whole chapter dedicated to the spinal cord and the attached spinal nerves. So that's more of the anatomy component. Functionally, we look at, sensory division. So, what are we detecting in our environment, or what are we detecting in our organs, right? We're constantly monitoring not just the outside of the body, but also the inside of the body. And we're going to need receptors for that to detect different things. It could be, touch or pain sensors in the skin, or it could be, say, a stretch sensor in your stomach or your bladder. to tell the CNS that, there's either food in our stomach or there's urine in our bladder. And then the motor division is the output. So sensory is more of an input, so it sends signals to the CNS, and then motor is the output. So those are the neurons that are going from the CNS to the effector organs. Effectors are whatever organs you're controlling. All right, so say you're controlling the heart. Well, the heart would be an effector. Or maybe we're going to stimulate the bladder so we can urinate. Well, that bladder is an effector. So the nervous system controls a lot of organs in the body. When we get to A&P2, we're going to still need to understand the nervous system because we get to these organs that are controlled by the nervous system. And a lot of those organs we learn about in A&P2. The key functional unit, kind of the communicating cells, are the neurons. This is a simple drawing of a neuron that we're going to use to understand how it sends these signals down the axon eventually to release neurotransmitters. So neurons are the communicating cells of the nervous system. They utilize electrical and chemical signals, the electrical signals being the action potential that travels, and then the chemical signal being the neurotransmitter that gets released. This is just kind of another diagram that I like to kind of put it into a little bit of a perspective involving, a sensory function here. So detecting light. So light reflecting off this glass of water, that's going to be the stimulus. So the stimulus is light. We need to have receptors for that. Those are found in your retina. So those are going to have what we call photoreceptors to detect that light. Then we're going to have to send that signal using sensory input, also called afferent. So these two words are similar in that it's kind of the same neuron. We can call a sensory neuron an afferent neuron. Sensory is more of the function, so it's detecting something. Afferent is the direction in which the signal's going. So afferent means you're going towards something. So these signals are going towards the CNS. So sensory neurons are afferent neurons because they are sending the signal to the CNS. And these could be, again, they could be either cranial or spinal nerves. In this case, we use a cranial nerve called the optic nerve to send the signal to the brain. In the brain, we call the process, that occurs in your brain integration or interpretation, right? So your brain's going to analyze what this means, right? Maybe using memory. Oh, I know what a glass of water is, using intelligence, using a lot of other, information to integrate and determine what to do. All right, so those neurons shown here in green are often referred to as interneurons because they lie in between the sensory and the motor neurons. So we analyze that information, then we might send a signal out. So that's going to be using the motor neurons or output. Those are often referred to as efferent. Efferent means the signal's going away, all right, or exiting. So afferent, you go to the brain. Efferent, you're going away from the brain or CNS. And eventually those lead to the effector. In this case, it's a skeletal muscle, and that's going to help us flex our elbow so we can drink that glass of water. So this is kind of a simple way to look at how the nervous system works, but this is how most of the information passes through our nervous system. It goes from stimulus to sensory neuron to integration in the brain or CNS and spinal cord, motor, effector, and then the response. Okay? So how is this all kind of organized? Now we're getting a little more detailed on this diagram. So we still show the CNS, right? Processing the information. On this side, it talks about examples of sensory. So we've got things like light, sound, taste, smell, touch, temperature, pain, pressure. There's all kinds of sensory things that our sensory division of the PNS can detect. We often divide it into one or the other. We can call it somatic senses. Somatic are more of the conscious things you can perceive. It usually involves, on your skin, so you can touch and you can sense pain and pressure and temperature. Somatic also involves your special senses, which is, vision, hearing, taste, smell, um, are all somatic. Visceral, that word visceral means internal organ. So those senses we typically don't perceive, right? They're usually kind of unconscious senses. So visceral would be things like we're sensing blood pressure, maybe we're sensing blood chemistry, maybe we're sensing chemicals in your stomach or in your intestines, so we know whether we need to digest our food. So the sensory division, you can think of it as somatic or visceral. Somatic, again, kind of being more consciously aware, special senses and things on your skin. And then visceral means internal organs. All that goes into the CNS. Again, sometimes it uses a cranial nerve, sometimes it uses spinal nerves. And then the motor division of the periphery can also be divided into somatic and autonomic. So somatic is going to be your voluntary control. So that's going to be voluntary control of skeletal muscle. Your autonomic nervous system is involuntary. And then that we're going to divide into two divisions. Sympathetic and parasympathetic. And there's going to be a whole chapter dedicated to this. And that comes towards the end of the semester. It's, to me, one of the most important chapters because this is the division that controls your heart, smooth muscle organs like your GI tract, respiratory tract, urinary tract, reproductive tracts, and glands. And that's a lot of the stuff we learn about in A&P2. So when we get to A&P2 and we're learning about the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, the respiratory system, the urinary system, we're going to have to understand how the autonomic nervous system controls those systems. Okay? But the autonomic is involuntary, somatic is voluntary. Okay? That's good for right now. When we get in a little further, we're going to learn that we often refer to sympathetic as fight or flight responses and parasympathetic as resting responses. So if you think about your heart, right, what do we want the heart to do if we're in a fight or flight or a sympathetic kind of situation? We want it to speed up. So that's done using the sympathetic division. If we want it to slow down at rest, we use the parasympathetic. All right, so we'll expand on that later in the semester. This is another diagram, a little more detailed yet again, but I think it does a pretty good job of giving you the big picture. All right, so how this diagram is laid out is you have your CNS here, brain, spinal cord. We see in blue is the sensory. So there's your somatic, all right, coming from primarily your skin senses, but also special senses. And then here is an example of a visceral sensory fiber. So that's going from your stomach. Remember, visceral's internal organ. All right. So there's your sensory. So we just show here that, that information goes into the CNS, okay, for interpretation. So notice this blue is going into the CNS, okay? And again, it can use cranial nerves or spinal nerves. Then the output, this diagram uses red. Blue was the sensory. Red is outgoing. So these are all efferent motor, all right? Here's the somatic nervous system going to skeletal muscle. All right, so we can come out of the CNS. Again, it could be cranial or spinal. we're going to go to the skeletal muscle and have voluntary control. Here's the autonomic, and again, that autonomic is divided into two divisions. We have the sympathetic division, which is more active when the body's more active, right? Fight or flight, exercise, things like that. Parasympathetic is more resting functions, all right? So keeping functions during rest. Also, instead of using energy, it's more of a conservation of energy. All right, so again, this is kind of the layout. Hopefully, as we get through the nervous system, when we go into the next chapter 12 and 13, this will start to become much more clear to you. All right. Okay, so next thing we're going to do in this video is go through the neuroglia cells. So these are the other cells. All right, they're not neurons, but they're serving some supporting role for the neurons, all right? And there's 6 of them. 4 of them are in your CNS, so brain and spinal cord, and then the last 2 are in the PNS, peripheral nerves. So we're going to go through each of them, kind of look at this little picture of them, and then describe just their major functions. So the first one are astrocytes. Astro means star because someone thought they kind of looked like little stars. They're the most abundant of the neuroglia cells. Very versatile. They do a number of different things. They kind of cling to neurons. They kind of attach to neurons. They will kind of fill a lot of the spaces in between neurons. They kind of hold the neurons in place. But they also form what's known as the blood-brain barrier. So that's actually shown right here. This is a capillary inside your brain, and then these are the astrocytes that kind of coat that blood capillary and form a barrier. All right, now what does this barrier do? It helps to prevent certain things from getting into your brain from the blood. So it's a protective barrier against maybe there's a toxin or something in the bloodstream that could harm the brain. We want to be able to have a barrier against that. The downside to this barrier is if we are developing maybe a medication that could be very useful to something dealing with your brain. Maybe it's schizophrenia, maybe it's Alzheimer's disease. We need to figure out a way to get it to cross that barrier and get into the brain. So the blood-brain barrier is good, and it's got some downsides to it. And then these astrocytes are also found to be important early in your development, kind of guiding neurons to where they're supposed to be. And then they do a little bit of information processing. We're not going to really talk about that. That's a little too deep for us. But the big thing here is most abundant. It's in the CNS. And one very important thing they do is form the blood-brain barrier. Okay, next one are called ependable cells. In this drawing, they're shown here. You can see that they kind of form a layer here. So they form kind of a membrane. And they have a little cilia. So if you remember way back when we learned about, cells, some cells have little cilia. And these little cilia are going to help move cerebrospinal fluid. So these guys are going to be very important in production of cerebrospinal fluid, which we'll talk more about in another chapter. But that's a liquid that kind of circulates throughout your brain and throughout the spinal cord. So they actually produce this fluid, then they circulate it using the cilia. And this fluid is found in what's called the ventricles of the brain. The brain, kind of like the heart, has containers. But inside the brain, what's in these ventricles is cerebrospinal fluid. So they line these cavities inside the brain, and then your spinal cord also has a little canal down the center of it. So that's where you find a lot of the cerebrospinal fluid. All right. Microglia were named microglia because they're small. They have little processes on them. Their job is in a little bit of repair work if there's damage in the CNS. These microglial cells can help repair injured neurons. And they're also immune cells. They're actually a specialized immune system cell that resides in the CNS. We often call that a resident macrophage. Macrophages can phagocytose pathogens and any kind of debris that might have occurred due to an injury. All right, so for these, what you want to remember is they're small, all right, micro. They can help repair tissue and they can help phagocytose pathogens that might have gotten into the CNS. Next one are the oligodendrocytes. So oligo means few, dendro means branches. They have a few branching processes. You can kind of see this would be a branch out here, here, and here. What they do is they form what's known as myelin or myelination in the CNS. We'll talk more about what myelination is, but it's this layers that are found around the axons of neurons. So this would be an axon. And this oligodendrocyte is forming these layers of fat that helps to speed up the rate in which an action potential can travel. So some neurons need to be really fast. So if you can myelinate them, the action potential will move faster. So you can see that this oligodendrocyte is actually myelinating this neuron here. It's myelinating this neuron there. So what they can do is they can form myelin on up to 50 different axons. So they can kind of reach out and produce this myelination on multiple neurons. All right. So that's going to be a little bit different than the other cell we're going to learn about that does this in the PNS. All right, so those were the four in the CNS: astrocytes, ependymal cells, microglia, and oligodendrocytes. The two in the PNS are the Schwann cells and satellite cells. Schwann cells are going to do myelination, but in the peripheral nervous system. So they're similar to the oligodendrocytes in that they form myelin. The difference is they can't myelinate many different neurons. They only myelinate one section of one neuron. All right, so here's an axon of a neuron, and there's the one Schwann cell wrapped around its axon. And then here's another one here. So in the PNS, it takes many Schwann cells to myelinate just one neuron. Whereas in the CNS, you can use an oligodendrocyte to myelinate multiple neurons. So it's a little bit different in how they produce the myelin, but the same function. And that myelination helps speed up action potentials. These cells have also been found to be able to regenerate damaged peripheral neurons as well. So that's a really important thing if there's a nerve injury that these Schwann cells can help repair. Satellite cells are also found in the PNS. They surround the cell bodies of neurons. We'll learn what the cell bodies are when we get to neurons, but that's where you're going to have the nucleus of the neuron. So these are all satellite cells. They kind of surround that cell body and provide structural and protective support. So I think they were called satellite because they kind of surround that cell body, kind of like satellites might surround the Earth. And again, they're more of a structural and protective cell for the neurons. All right, so that was the first video. We introduced the nervous system. We talked about the neuroglial cells. The second video, we're going to actually start to get into the neurons, the cells that can transmit electrical signals.